The Face of God and the Face of Language. A treatise on theophany, idiom, and the limits of reading across cultures. 1. The problem stated. Scripture presents what looks, at first glance, like a flat contradiction. Jacob wrestles through the night at Peniel and declares, "I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered." Genesis chapter 32, verse 30. Centuries later, John opens his gospel with the flat assertion that no one has ever seen God. John chapter 1, verse 18. Between these two poles sits the Exodus narrative, which seems to argue with itself. Moses speaks with the Lord, face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Exodus chapter 33, verse 11. Yet only a few verses later is told, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." Exodus chapter 33, verse 20. The standard theological resolution distinguishes God's transcendent, unmediated essence from his accommodated, visible manifestations, the theophanies, and, in Christian reading, the Christophanies, in which the pre-incarnate Son appears in forms creatures can survive. John chapter 1, verse 18 is then read as the capstone. No one has seen the Father's naked essence, but the Son has made him known, and the Old Testament face-to-face encounters were partial, accommodated previews of that final revelation. That resolution is sound theology, but it is worth asking whether it is the whole answer, or whether some of the apparent tension is being manufactured by reading ancient idiom as if it were modern technical prose. 2. 4 texts, 1 idiom. Laid side by side, the 4 passages trace a single Hebrew idiom, panim el-panim, face-to-face, across 3 very different settings, plus its Greek reception in John. Genesis chapter 32, verse 30, theophany. Jacob, having wrestled a man/angel at Peniel, names the place after the encounter and marvels that he survived it. The claim is physical and visual. A human being met an accommodated appearance of the divine and lived. Exodus chapter 33, verse 11, relational intimacy. The Lord speaks to Moses at the tent of meeting, as one speaks to a friend. Numbers chapter 12, verse 8 later glosses this same relationship as speech, mouth to mouth, clearly, and not in riddles. Here, face-to-face describes the quality of the conversation, direct and unmediated by dream or vision, not a claim about optics. Exodus chapter 33, verse 20, essential glory. Moses asks to see God's glory itself, chapter 33, verse 18, and here the text shifts registers. No one can see God's unmediated essence and live. God hides Moses in the cleft of the rock and lets him see only the aftermath, his back. John chapter 1, verse 18, theological commentary. Writing in Koine Greek and in a philosophical idiom concerned with essence and category, John agrees with Exodus chapter 33, verse 20, that no one has seen God's unmediated being, and then supplies the resolution. The Son, at the Father's side, has made him known, has exegeted him, to use John's own verb. Read this way, the 4 texts are not contradicting one another so much as operating with 2 distinct senses of the same idiom, panim el-panim, as relational directness, Genesis chapter 32, Exodus chapter 33, verse 11, and seeing God's face as a claim about beholding unmediated essence, Exodus chapter 33, verse 20, John chapter 1, verse 18. The tension dissolves not by explaining it away, but by reading the idiom on its own terms. 3. Escaping the text, or reading it rightly. There is a legitimate suspicion that spiritualizing a hard verse can be a way of escaping it, softening a plain claim because it is inconvenient rather than because the text itself calls for it. That suspicion should be kept. Not every hard saying is idiom in disguise, and the move to, "it's just a figure of speech," can become a reflex that flattens Scripture in the opposite direction, draining it of its concrete, startling claims. But the same caution that guards against too easy spiritualizing should also guard against too easy literalism, the assumption that a word must mean the same thing every time it appears, regardless of speaker, genre, era, or setting. That assumption is not conservative reverence for the text. It is an anachronism, imported from how modern, print-literate, standardized languages tend to work. Ancient Near Eastern language did not work that way, and recognizing this is a matter of linguistics and history before it is a matter of theology. 4. 2 models for how language actually behaves. 2 modern, real-world cases illustrate the kind of variation that ancient Hebrew and its later Greek reception likely also contained. The India model, shared roots, divergent meaning. India is vast and linguistically diverse enough that people who appear, to an outsider, to share a common language and enough cultural traits to understand one another easily, in fact, often do not. Geographic closeness and shared linguistic ancestry do not guarantee shared meaning. Ancient Israel's language moved the same way over time and geography, A phrase used by a nomadic patriarch wrestling in the Transjordan need not carry identical freight when it resurfaces centuries later in the courtly, liturgical setting of the tabernacle narratives. High-context cultures load idioms with meaning that insiders grasp intuitively and outsiders must painstakingly reconstruct. The Canada model: surface unity, deep divergence. Canada shows the inverse problem: one nation, one federal umbrella, and yet two linguistic communities, English and French, that shape law, politics, and everyday idiom in fundamentally different conceptual worlds. This mirrors what happened when biblical thought crossed from Hebrew into Koine Greek. Hebrew is concrete and action-oriented. Panim, face, shifts meaning with the verb it is paired with: presence, favor, anger, confrontation, and rarely settles into a fixed, abstract definition. Greek, shaped by Hellenistic philosophy, cares about essence, category, and ontology. When John writes that no one has seen God, he is making a categorical claim in a Greek philosophical idiom. When Genesis narrates Jacob's encounter, it is telling a concrete story in a Hebrew narrative idiom. Both sit under the single canopy of Scripture, the way English and French both sit under the Canadian Constitution, without either language fully translating the other's assumptions. The American assumption. By contrast, the United States gives many readers a mistaken baseline expectation. That language works like a single standardized highway, where a word keeps one fixed, literal meaning across every region and register. Most of the world does not work this way, and neither did the biblical world. Applying that flattened, low-context expectation to a high-context, multi-era, multi-language text produces exactly the kind of apparent contradiction under discussion here. 5. Toward a disciplined middle path. The honest position is neither reflexive literalism nor reflexive spiritualizing. It is attention to idiom, genre, era, and audience. The ordinary discipline of reading any ancient text closely, applied without embarrassment to Scripture. On that reading, Genesis chapter 32 verse 30 and Exodus chapter 33 verse 11 describe real, accommodated encounters and real relational intimacy. Exodus chapter 33 verse 20 and John chapter 1 verse 18 describe the impossibility of surviving God's unmediated essence, and the apparent contradiction between them is the residue of two different uses of one idiom, not a seam that needs to be theologically stitched shut. Recognizing that is not an escape from the text. It is closer reading of it. The same kind of attention any reader would give to a phrase that means one thing in a village in Kerala and another thing entirely 3 states over. Thought Tapestries, a working note on theophany, idiom, and reading across cultures.